Hello, my name is Gloria Pan, and I am Vice President at Moms Rising, where I lead the campaign to stop gun violence. Welcome to this conversation, when Asian Americans buy guns to feel safe, potential harms, and electoral risks. Moms Rising, in case you haven't heard of us, is a multi-issue and intersectional national organization of more than 1 million moms and family members working together to build a country where everyone can thrive, including Asian Americans. First, I actually just came out of another session on misinformation and disinformation in communities of color, and I talked about some of that happening in the Asian American related to gun violence. So if you were there and you followed me here, thank you. Giving you a shout out. So I am going to start with giving everybody a little bit of context. Asian Americans account for 7% of Americans, and that small 7% contains multitudes. We are a dizzying and constantly evolving diversity, with members hailing from 50 countries and ethnic groups and speaking more than 100 languages. In 1960, there were only 1 million of us in the United States. Today, there are 23 million, and this means that 95% of Asian Americans are immigrants or children of immigrants. We are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the United States who are increasingly making our political presence known through voter participation. Voter data from the 2020 presidential election revealed record turnout from the community, with Asian Americans early and absentee voting rising almost 300% in many states. During the COVID-19 pandemic, xenophobic political statements blaming China contributed to a surge in anti-Asian hate, including street violence against Asian Americans. Our community is living in fear, and there's compelling evidence that we are increasingly turning to firearms as the answer to feel safe. Meanwhile, the gun industry is doing its best to add fuel to this fire, employing language aimed at not only selling guns, but also expanding their electoral support across the nation for their deadly right-wing policy agenda. Historically, Asian Americans have owned very few guns, and that is precisely why, actually, across all communities, we have experienced the lowest rates of gun violence. That the gun industry is now targeting our community is very troubling, because normalizing gun ownership would not only increase injury and death among Asian Americans, but could also have critical electoral impacts. We have an amazing panel. I am so honored to be working with my fellow speakers here. First, we will have Paul Murray from the Newtown Action Alliance. She's going to be talking about the gun violence prevention landscape. And then after that, we are thrilled to share new research. Suyin Wu at Eastern Michigan University and Xinfang Xie at the University of Michigan will connect some dots about how anti-Asian racism and discrimination is linked to firearms purchases and firearms-related risk behavior. And then Josh Sugarman from the Violence Policy Center will tell us about how the gun industry is taking advantage of this moment to build an anti-Asian market for firearms. And finally, Andy Wang from Chinese for Affirmative Action, one of the founding organizations of Stop AAPI Hate, will pull all of these threads together for us. Throughout our discussion and our time together, please feel free to share your thoughts and questions in the chat box, and we will try to get to them after each presentation, assuming that there's time. And we will also aim to have time at the end to open up the conversation generally. So let's get started. First up, let's welcome Paul Murray, Chair of the Newtown Action Alliance. Paul, welcome. Please tell us why guns will not make Asian Americans safer.
Thank you, Gloria, and good afternoon to all. I'm really proud to join this amazing group of panelists today to share our thoughts on why it's so important for Asian Americans to not allow the National Rifle Association, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, other gun lobby groups, and the gun industry to use fear tactics to convince people who look like me to buy more guns. I know firsthand that guns don't make us safer. On December 14, 2012, my neighbor shot his mother in her bed. Then he drove to Sandy Hook Elementary School and used weapons of war to murder 20 children and 6 educators. Then he shot himself. The shooter's mom thought those guns would protect her and her family in my neighborhood, but it didn't. We formed the Newtown Action Alliance and the Newtown Action Alliance Foundation to create legislative changes to end all forms of gun violence in this nation and to convince Americans that guns don't make us safer. During the last 9 years, I've learned a lot about gun violence, and I want to share what I've learned. I hope that the information, data, and the stories will convince my fellow Asian Americans that guns are not the answer. Guns won't make any of us safer. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. And I hope you can see the presentation. Can you see?
Yes.
Yes, great. So in the United States, we have 4% of the world's population, but Americans own 400 million guns, or 40% of civilian guns in the world. With more guns than people in our nation, the US homicide rate is 25 times higher than other high-income nations. In 2019, the Gallup poll showed that 63% of gun owners made a choice to own guns for personal safety and protection. This is a direct result of 40 years of unrelenting and unapologetic messaging from the gun lobby groups. They have misrepresented the Second Amendment and systematically weakened our gun laws to allow illegal guns to flow easily into our urban streets. And then they use fear tactics to convince the rest of us to arm up, suggesting that anyone with a gun could stop a bad guy with a gun. Because Americans are less likely to hunt and buy hunting rifles in a more modern America, the gun lobby groups and the gun industry made a pivot to sell more handguns and assault weapons to civilians. The gun lobby, on behalf of the gun industry, has been promoting its guns to anyone everywhere agenda, and the industry is profiting from the gun violence crisis in our nation. In reality, though, 400 million guns in America have not made us safer. US has the 32nd highest rate of gun deaths in the world, nearly 4 deaths for 100,000 people. In stark contrast, prosperous Asian nations such as Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and China, with strong gun laws and low gun ownership, have the lowest rate, 0.01 to 0.02 per 100,000 people. Studies show that states like Mississippi, Alabama, Wyoming, Missouri, and Louisiana with high gun ownership and weak gun laws have higher rates of gun deaths. States with lower gun ownership and stronger gun laws have lower rates of gun death. Sadly, Congress has failed to take action after the Sandy Hook tragedy, and the number of gun deaths and injuries have been steadily rising since 2012. Now, an average of 40,000 Americans are killed by guns and 80,000 Americans are injured by guns every single year. The gun violence epidemic is a man-made tragedy that costs our society $280 billion annually. Since there is no national gun registry, firearm industry publications and background checks are the best sources for gauging gun sales. In year 2000, there were less than 9 million NICS background checks for gun purchases. But in 2020, there were nearly 40 million background checks. Small Arms Analytics data shows Americans bought 23 million guns last year, a whopping 64% increase from 2019, with millions being new gun owners. Sadly, more guns were sold in 2020 than in any previous year on record, due to the pandemic anxiety and the civil unrest during Black Lives Matter protests. It didn't help that some gun safety champions, like my governor, Ned Lamont from Connecticut, made gun stores essential during the pandemic lockdown. That was a deadly mistake. As gun sales surged, gun deaths did as well. CD is projecting 45,000 gun deaths in 2020, a 15% increase from 2019, highest levels in decades. Clearly, there are consequences of having more guns in our nation, particularly in 21 states that do not require permits or training to openly carry guns. Not surprisingly, CDC data shows a 30% increase in homicides from 2019 to 2020, 77% of them from guns. Our friends from Gun Violence Archive track gun violence data in real time, and the numbers are alarming. There have been 548 mass shooting incidents where 4 or more people are shot in an incident. Number of times guns were brandished or fired on school property increased as well. There were 24 incidents in September of last year and 55 incidents in September of this year. Asian Americans are not immune from gun violence. Virginia Tech, Isla Vista, and the Collierville Kroger grocery store mass shooters were Asians. And Oak Creek, Atlanta Spa, and the Indianapolis FedEx mass shooting victims were Asians and South Asians. Sadly, firearms surpass motor vehicles as the #1 cause of death for American children and teens, and Black and brown children are most impacted by gun violence. If more and more Asian Americans decide to put more guns into our homes, then our children will become victims of gun violence. On average, over 3,000 children and teens are killed by guns every year. That's 9 children a day. Thousands more are injured. My friends Kristen Song and Mike Song, who is Korean American, could tell you that guns don't make our children safer. Almost 4 years ago, 15-year-old Ethan went to his best friend's house after getting his braces removed. He was killed by a gun that was left unsecured in a shoebox in the closet. Nearly 5 million children in America live in homes with at least one unsecured gun. That is why the American Academy of Pediatrics advises that the safest homes for our children are ones without guns. Research shows the most effective way to prevent unintentional gun injuries, suicide, and homicide to children and adolescents is the absence of guns in our homes and communities. Studies also show that living in homes with guns doubles our risk for homicides and triples our risk for suicides. Guns will not make Asian American homes safer. Suicide is also the leading cause of death among Asian Americans aged 20 to 24 years, responsible for about 33% of deaths in that age bracket. Guns in Asian American homes will triple our risk for suicides. And guns won't make Asian American women safer either. Every month, an average of 57 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner. Domestic abuse is 5 times more likely to turn deadly if firearms are present in the home. And the truth is, defensive gun use is rare. There are about 2,000 verified cases of defensive gun use annually, which are vastly outnumbered by more than 40,000 gun deaths, 80,000 non-fatal injuries, hundreds of thousands of abusive uses, and more than 200,000 annual gun thefts. Stolen guns end up in our streets illegally and become crime guns. I hope that the information, data, and stories I just shared today will help Asian Americans to dismiss the gun lobby rhetoric and marketing tactics and make a decision to live in a gun-free home to keep our children, families, and communities safer. I encourage everyone to visit the Newtown Action Alliance Foundation and the Moms Rising websites for information and resources in different Asian languages to help convince Asian Americans that guns won't make us safer. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the slideshow here.
Thank you, Po. So we have speaker view, all of us, so we don't really see who's out in the audience. So we ask everyone to say hello in the chat box so we know that there are actually people out there. Please say hello. And again, throughout our conversation and time together, if you have any thoughts or questions that come up in your head as we are talking, please share them in the chat box. So before we move on, Po, I just thank you for being such a strong advocate for gun safety for all Americans, and now at this moment for Asian Americans. Recently, you shared something very personal with me about how gun violence actually was really, really close to you, and I wonder if you would be willing to share it now. Po, you seem to be slowing down. You're on mute.
Hello, can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. So in 5th grade, my father broke into my mother's house and he hit her in the head with a 2x4 and she nearly died. She was a victim of domestic abuse, and I know that if my father owned a gun or if we had a gun in the house, that she would not be alive today. Domestic violence, like I said earlier, is deadly when guns are in the home. And I'm hoping that more Asian Americans will pay attention, to that fact.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that painful moment with us. Okay, so now moving along, we have other really important information and thoughts to share from other speakers. So next up, we would like to welcome Tzuyin Wu and Xinfang Xie. Tzuyin is director of the Healthy Asian American Project at the Center for Health Disparities Innovation and Studies at Eastern Michigan University. And Xinfang Xie is a research scientist from the University of Michigan Prevention Research Collaborative. Tzuyin and Xinfang, we are so excited to see your new research. How are Asian Americans now vulnerable to racism and discrimination, and how is that connected to firearm purchases and firearm-related risk behavior?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Xinfang Xie. Again, very excited here today to be able to share what we know about racism against Asian Americans and how that linked to mental distress and firearm outcomes.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So excited, to be in this panel to share with you our research, very important topic. I'm Tzuyin Wu from West Michigan, and I'm a faculty. My real-time job, I always tell people, I'm a faculty professor at School of Nursing, but most of my time is devoted to the research where my Center for Health Disparity Innovation and Studies, doing different kinds of health initiatives to promote the health and well-being of underserved population, particularly focused on Asian Americans in Midwest. So I'm going to turn it back to Kei Xinfang, and Kei will start to kind of share with you our the only so far we find the firearm-related research in the U.S. focused on APA. So, Kay, if you could share your screen.
Yes. Can everyone see the share screen right now? Give me a sign. Thank you. Yes. To begin with, I want to just rephrase what we're seeing here for Asian Americans during this pandemic. What are we facing right now? Really is increased racism incidents, thousands of cases with just within 1 year period that was reported for racism incidents among Asian Americans. And we all know it's an underestimate because not everyone experienced that or reported. We also see a huge increase of hate crime against Asian Americans. And given all that, with the Atlanta spot shooting, we all know that Asian Americans are really suffering from tremendous fear. And understandably, there's a surge of firearm purchase because they are convinced that firearm might make them safe. And we'll talk about why it's not. We also know that Asian Americans, when they are from mental distress and mental health issues, they're actually 3 times as likely to seek for mental health services. And that is why we want to see the role of mental distress here. So again, there's no research that we could find previously that had examined how racism against Asian Americans linked to both mental health outcome and the firearm outcome. That's why it leads to Dr. Tzuyin Wu and myself to ask these 3 key questions. First, how firearm safety look like among Asian American community? Secondly, how does racism experience link to firearm purchase and firearm risk among Asian Americans? And then thirdly, what is the role of mental distress in this relationship we're seeing? So we are able to reach out to a sample called Dynata Simplify panel that consists of 2.5 million US residents. We're able to recruit the participants from there. And within about 2-month period, we're able to recruit 916 Asian Americans as our participants. And within them, we have 60% of them being female. And also we got this 5 largest East and Southeast Asian Americans participate in our study. That includes Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and some other Asian American ethnicity groups. So the first question we ask, how's firearm ownership look like in this sample? And we found about 18% of our participants said that they either personally own gun or their family member own a gun. And then when we take a look at the firearm purchase during the pandemic, what we see is a total of 12% of our Asian American participants said that they either purchased the gun since the pandemic or they intended to. And then there's a pie of it is that they already purchased a gun since the pandemic, and they also intend to purchase more. And then among those who purchased a gun, we strikingly found that over 50%, over half of them were first-time gun owners. And then when you take a fuller look into the gun owners, it's also a surprise to me that over 30% of them said they either purchased or intend to purchase more ammunition. This is warning signs to us. They are trying to purchase more gun and more ammunition, and potentially because they want to protect themselves. In terms of firearm safety, we asked 2 questions. Whether they store their gun unlocked or whether they store their gun loaded. And this is what we see. You see the light blue part is the percentage of people who said, yes, they did store their gun unlocked. That is 50% of them. And similarly, almost 45% of them said they store their gun loaded. That's strikingly high. And also notably, about 37.5% of those individuals own gun. They said they actually carry their gun more frequently since the pandemic. All those keep in mind that it's heightened risk among our Asian American community for firearm injury and firearm mortality. I'm going to stop here and hand it over to Dr. Zuying Wu to talk more about the predictors of these firearm outcomes.
Thank you, Dr. Xinfang Xie. So, so my part is to explaining, what's inside of this black box, what I call it, because we want to understand, right? Kate, if you don't mind to, put the slides back. And so we want to understand that why, where you heard from Kate that increased gun purchase and demolitions, and they even want to buy more. And earlier you also heard about, and probably in the media you also saw all kinds of anti-hate crimes and racisms that experiencing during the pandemic, Chinese, and other Asians. And so the next slide, please, Kate, is to tell you that what are the predictors, right? So what's predicting all these kind of increase in gun purchase. And so we know that when I highlighted in red, it was like, oh wow, the number. Yes, if you have someone personally own a gun in your family, or you personally own a gun, it likely increase the purchase during the pandemic, and also emulations, and the odds ratio is 60 times more likely of odds to purchase it, as well as both gun as well as emulation. And the same predictor is about intention. So for those people who are thinking about to buy it more, it's more likely for those people who already have a gun in their household, as well as themselves have a gun. And the other predictor, I think is somewhat similar in other ethnic groups, probably is a younger age. If you're younger compared to older, it's a predictor. Next slide, please. So earlier that we talked about racism, right? So is a racism actually predicting the gun purchase? And we saw the media portrait, and this is the studies that we really kind of tie in together to see what are some type of racism experience, predicting and, correlating with the gun purchase. So there, we measure 3 type of racism. Is the actual racism that, APA, Asian American experience. And the second one is a cultural racism, like, because you're Asians and because, you look like Chinese. So it's the racism, cultural racism. And the third one is a stress, right? So after you Asian American experience all these racism, there's a anticipatory, or actual stress. So we measure these 3 types, and in the study findings, that we clearly see the racism, the actual experience, and cultural racism increase the predicting the gun purchase for Asian Americans. And the stress itself is actually only, predicts the intention. So if you have some kind of stress related to racism, the study data actually show it's, increase your intention. And I think the third strikingly, finding is that for those gun owners, right? And you're talking about, their the higher risk, which meaning that, they are actually, if they have some kind of racism experience, then they're more likely to carry the gun with them outside of their home. So, you could look into all these kind of relationships, very critical relationships, about how racism kind of precipitates the gun firearm, risk, very much so in this study findings. Next slide, please. So earlier is that we heard about Paul, we heard about Kate talked about the importance of the mental distress. This including the depressions, the anxiety, right? So as a researcher, we like to explain the behavior, looking at the model. So the model says that yes, if you look at the outcome as gun purchase, either gun or munitions, racism experience, the 3 things I talked about, increase the gun purchase, behavior. And so the next one is, what about the mental stress that, these people experience? The mental stress also, has a direct relationship, saying if you experience all these stress, you're going to increase your gun purchase and militia purchase. And so the third line actually shows up that if you experience the racism, cultural racism or racial discrimination, it's more likely to you also experience more anxiety, all those mental distress. So this is important kind of model when you think about how these racism going to impact Asian American, and this is a model to show you that. Next slide, please. So earlier slide is about actual firearm purchase, and this is about the risk, right? So earlier we talked about how you storage the gun unlocked, or how the second thing is that you carry it. So these 2 things compose of the much more higher risk if you store them unlocked and safely at your household, or you carry them, right? So in the model, we saw that if you experience, Asian Americans experience racism, racial discrimination, then that increase that their risk of unsafe storage, and also carry them more. And earlier I shared you about those people who experience racism, and they are more likely to carry them outside of their household. And so the mental health issues, if you look at the second line, in this case, that we see people experience racism, that they are more likely to have mental distress. However, we did not see the mental distress actually, have a direct path to the firearm risk, which is storage and carrying them. And I think, this is just want to share with you very simple, clear pictures, for you. And I'm sure that this is the time Gloria will come in to.
Yes, tell us the implications.
So I think, this is, I think I have some just a very quick things to say is that as a researcher, I think it's really important for us present to the general public a unbiased kind of findings like this. And we were really glad this is the first study, because in the past, when we go out there trying to look for the study in the major database, there's just no Asian Americans, whatsoever. And so we feel it's really important that for us to make informed decisions, we really need to gather all the information, science, data, study findings to make people make the, informed best decision out there. So this is, my 2.8. And Kate.
Yes, sure. May I share?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think three takeaways that from our findings. One is that we do see that racism can have several negative outcomes. One is mental distress. The other two are firearm purchase and increased firearm risk. So that's a major takeaway from this. And in the future, I think it's important to look into the intersectionality between firearm ownership and mental distress, because we all know that the suicidal rate can increase, and the complete suicide can increase, the risk can increase if you do have the firearm involved. And also the intersectionality between firearm ownership and the domestic violence and children's safety. So those are the three takeaways, I would say, based on our finding, to put further attention to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Xin-Fang and Tzu-Yin. I'm looking forward to the actual publication of your research. Okay, so what we just heard from Xin-Fang and Tzu-Yin was that, yes, the pandemic led to a rise in anti-Asian hate, and out of that, Asian Americans experienced greater stress and greater likelihood to buy firearms. So this is a snapshot. It's a snapshot of the vulnerability in our community. And yes, there is an actual campaign to take advantage of this vulnerability. So now I would like to welcome Josh. Josh Sugarman is Executive Director and founder of the Violence Policy Center. Josh, please tell us how the gun industry is now exploiting the vulnerability of the Asian American community for their nefarious ends.
Thank you, Gloria. Let me see if I can share my screen. And the answer is going to be no. Okay, so instead of fiddling in front of you trying to share my screen, I will sort of walk through what I was going to present, and hopefully in my very colorful language, I'll give you an image of what my presentation might have been like. I'm the executive director of the Violence Policy Center, and last month we issued a study called How the Firearms Industry Markets Guns to Asian Americans. And what we have found is that really what defines the industry today is the fact that household gun ownership has declined over the past few decades and remains relatively stagnant, even in light of the recent increase we've seen in firearm sales. For example, in 1977, about half of American homes had a gun in them. By 2018, it had dropped to about 34%. And that's primarily because of the stagnation of the primary market of white males. They bought all the guns they're going to buy, they're dying off, there are no replacement shooters, to steal a phrase in the tobacco industry. And that's why the industry has targeted select groups following this trail. It's women, it's children, and it's communities of color. This is nothing new. As early as 1997, Shooting Sports Retailer, which is a gun industry publication, had a column with the headline, "Gun industry must become less racist to survive in the 21st century." No, it's not "don't be racist," but less racist. And after bemoaning the fact that, as they called it, people of Northern European descent, everyone who had a gun had one, they said that we have to look at America's racial and ethnic minorities and refer to these groups as a large untapped market. The leader, or sort of the command and control center for this effort, is the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the official trade association for the firearms industry. And we can trace the coordinated, comprehensive effort targeting communities of color back to what they call their industry summit in 2015. They have this every year. The gun makers get together. They talk about how to sell more guns, what threats they're facing from their perspective, just like any other industry. And in 2015, the theme of the summit was diversity. And afterwards, in a series of kind of self-congratulatory press releases and columns, they talked about how they're ready to innovate for change, and they're about to experience, quote, a groundswell shift in their attitude regarding marketing firearms to communities of color. One of the presenters at the 2015 event was Chris Chang. His claim to fame is that he won the top shot shooting competition on the History Channel without any formal training. And his presentation was called Diversity, the Next Big Opportunity. And he promised, quote, new shooters, new gun owners, and new Second Amendment advocates. And in a call to action, he talked about targeting messaging at ethnic and racial groups, quote unquote diversity programs, and highlighting people of color in firearm ads, media articles, and marketing. Also, at the event, they would have presentation looking at potential future gun buyers, breaking them out by race, ethnicity, Asian shooters, Hispanic shooters, and African-American shooters were the headlines for these slides, breaking them out by demographics, as they called it, psychographics, and technographics, basically ascribing qualities to these different racial ethnic groups. Now, for the most part, this effort focused on Black and Latino Americans. But what we saw in the past year and a half is that recognizing the horrific crimes being committed against Asian Americans, what most of us saw as, you know, a horror and a shame to our nation, the gun industry saw as an opportunity. And so expand their efforts to move beyond the Black and brown communities. And the most visible proponent of this effort was Chris Chang, who we just heard about a few moments ago at the 2015 Diversity Summit. And basically, Chang took his own advice. As he explained to a pro-gun blog, he said, you know, and I'm going to read here, an Asian group would fill a hole in current efforts by the gun rights movement and the firearms industry to reach new demographics. We have a template and a blueprint for how this can be successful. Now the challenge is taking that and applying it to Asian Americans. As part of that, Chang offered his endorsement to a newly funded organization called AAPI Go, Asian American Pacific Islander Gun Owners. And he offered his full support and resources and promoted the organization. A side note, AAPI Go is now the Asian Pacific American Gun Owners Association, APA-GOA, because of an internecine battle that occurred between the founders when one of them said that, well, not all gun control is bad, and that he'd be willing to talk to Joe Biden about ways to reduce gun violence. So he was quickly kicked out. One of the, or perhaps the key, without doubt, marketing argument made by the industry and other proponents of gun ownership are that guns are effective self-defense tools. And this has been repeated across the board, regardless of race, creed, or color. But the fact is that guns are rarely used to kill criminals or stop crimes. Looking at justifiable homicides reported to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for Asian Americans, in 2019, only 2 justifiable homicides committed by Asian Americans were reported to the FBI. Looking back over 5 years, 2015 and 2019, only 37 justifiable homicides were committed with guns by Asian Americans. Now, during the same 5-year period, the 2015 to 2019, 3,076 Asian Americans died in homicides involving guns, suicides, unintentional shootings, and other gun deaths. So look at this 5-year period. What you find is that for every time an Asian American used a gun in a justifiable homicide, 83 Asian American lives were lost in firearm homicides, suicides, unintentional shootings, and other gun deaths. It's important to remember that it's not just sales, but hoped for pro-gun political foot soldiers for the gun control battles that lie ahead. In, I believe, October 2020, in their activist magazine, America's First Freedom, the NRA talked about how what they hoped the political impact would be of increased gun ownership among Asian Americans. And this is just a quote from the piece. Many of those new gun owners have a practical stake in the preservation of the Second Amendment and the prevention of draconian gun control laws that attempt to criminalize their peaceful behavior and make scapegoats of the peaceful. Obviously, that's the NRA's view. And then they add this note of hope. Perhaps in the coming election, so much for that, but certainly soon after, these alterations will yield a change in our political debate. And that's the bottom line, and that's the goal. It's not just additional dollars in gun industry coffers, but hope for political impact, looking forward to stop gun violence prevention efforts. So I had 4 pictures of 4 studies that are relevant to this, but all I can say is that we've done research looking at the marketing to Black and Latino Americans, Asian Americans, marketing guns to children by the gun industry, and also long-term trends in gun ownership. So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Josh. There has not been enough research and analysis of gun violence prevention in general, and really now in this moment, there has been almost none. So we thank you so very much for shining a light on this intersection of gun violence and Asian Americans. You know, the effort by the NRA and the gun lobby it's incredibly scary, because disinformation is really a very big problem in general in the progressive space. And within the Asian American community, there are so many nooks and crannies for it to seep into, right? Because we speak so many different languages, we're in so many different places in our journey to become Americans. And what we do know about the gun lobby and the NRA is that they are extraordinarily good at disinformation, and this is all part of it. So thank you. There are a lot of ramifications to this, and I would like to move on and invite Andy to pull everything together for us. Andy is Director of Advocacy at Chinese for Affirmative Action. Andy, what does everything mean that we have heard today?
Well, Gloria, thank you so much. And, you know, I wanted to just also thank my fellow panelists and Netroots Nation for this really critical conversation about APIs, the guns industry's efforts to promote gun sales to our communities, and the potential harms and political risks. As Gloria indicated, I'm part of CAA, and we're a 50-year-old civil rights and social justice organization based in San Francisco's Chinatown. And we are also one of the 3 founding partners of the Stop API Hate Coalition, which is the national coalition working to address anti-API racism. And I'm here to say that guns are not the solution to stopping API hate, and also addressing the systemic racism and white supremacy that's impacting our API communities. And as part of my presentation, what I'm hoping to do is connect the dots by illuminating the actual nature of anti-API hate, because I think once we kind of understand sort of the nature of the violence and the hate, I think that will help to dispel kind of what we're hearing from the firearms industry and the gun lobby with respect to actually protecting ourselves and our families and our communities. I'm also hoping to talk a little bit about how the movement around Stop API Hate has been a galvanizing political force for our communities, and really what's at stake as it pertains to guns and its potential risk, both politically but also with respect to our community safety. So at the outset, with respect to sort of the racism and the hate that we're facing, I should just note that this is not a new phenomenon. We have, as a community, faced longstanding hate, racism, and violence. You know, every time there's a war, a recession, or a pandemic, we are scapegoated. We are targeted for violence, and we're subjected to draconian laws and policies, whether it's the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Japanese internment, or the hate that's faced by the MEMSA communities in the wake of 9/11. So I just want to note that at the outset. But I also think that it's important to recognize what transpired during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is that at the outset of this pandemic, you had a sitting US president engaging in racial and xenophobic rhetoric that was responsible for the surge in anti-API hate violence. When he used the term Chinese virus and Kung flu, that really exacerbated anti-API hate. And also I think media representation reinforced, I think, this perception or this notion that somehow, AAPIs had something to do with what transpired with respect to the pandemic. And just so you know, since Stop API Hate was founded, there have been over 9,000 incident reports to the coalition from March 19, 2020 to our latest reporting was on June 30th. And so, and also with respect to the nature of the hate incidences, women actually make up 63.3% of all reports. So women are, AAPI women are 2 times more likely than AAPI men to report that they faced a hate incident. And I think it's really important to just note that a lot of what's happening against API communities is not violence per se, and it's not criminal in nature. A lot of what's going on is what we consider to be hate incidences and not necessarily hate violence. And just with respect to the nature of the incidences that we've had to deal with, most of it has had to do with verbal harassment and shunning. I should also just note that in a recent study, 60% of Asian-owned businesses reported large negative impacts compared to 40% of all California businesses. So this was a study that sort of gauged the impacts of the pandemic on businesses overall, and Asian-owned businesses were disproportionately impacted. So that just sort of gives you, I think, hopefully a sense of the nature of what we're dealing with. A lot of hate incidents is not necessarily all of it violent or criminal in nature, women having to deal with more, and also our Asian businesses being impacted. So Stop API Hate was founded at the beginning of the pandemic because there are all these community members that were coming to our various organizations saying, we're being harmed, where do we go to? And so we created this data reporting center. And since then, we've collected, as I noted, over 9,000 incident reports, and we've been able to, I think, spark a national movement, right, around addressing anti-API racism nationally. I want to talk a little bit about the political impact of anti-API hate, because it really has become a galvanizing force for our communities in really powerful and profound ways. So I don't know if folks have been reading up on Politico, but I do on a regular basis, and they came out with a really powerful poll of about nearly, I think, 2,000 API adults over the course of June 2021, so fairly recent. And it was illuminating, and I think it provided, I think, a snapshot in terms of how anti-API hate has really reshaped, I think, the API electorate, API voters. So 2 in 10 API adults are now more likely to identify with the broader API label than they were pre-pandemic. This is a really notable shift for our community, which tends to be nationality first, right? Most API community members usually will, self-identify as Chinese American or Japanese American or Vietnamese American. Now, as a result of the anti-API hate, there's more identification under sort of the API umbrella. And that's really powerful politically, because it means that we have a more sort of cohesive political identity. And it's not simply a label, but that we are now sort of seeing ourselves as part of a broader API, sort of pan-API identity. I should also know that 65% of response said violence was a major threat. During the pandemic, discrimination and white supremacy are also major threats. And this is, I think, going to be really important, because in the past, I think a lot of folks think that immigration or education are the things that sort of dominate our thinking with respect to policy. And what I think this poll reveals is that actually violence, discrimination, and white supremacy are becoming even greater threats. And then finally, and this is a really powerful finding, over 70% of API adults blamed Donald Trump for the discrimination against our community. And that's the highest blame directed toward an individual. So, and then just another finding is that API still mostly trust Democrats over Republicans to handle major policy priorities. And there's really, there's a double-digit gap in confidence on most of the major issues. So on gun safety, 46% of respondents trust Democrats in Congress, compared with just 16% who trust Republicans. I should just add as a caveat that there's a significant portion of API adults that said they didn't trust either party to handle these policy issues. So the key takeaways from this poll and from what we're seeing with respect to Stop API Hate is that API are significantly more likely to be mobilized by sheer fear of violence and discrimination than before the pandemic. And this is important to know because addressing racial bias and racial discrimination is going to be very important to APIs as a whole. If you're going to meet us where we're at, you're really going to need to talk about the broader racial bias and discrimination that we're facing right now. And APIs are also growing increasingly turned off by Trump's anti-immigrant and anti-China rhetoric. And I should just note that this is going to be an ongoing development, right? Our leadership is engaging in a great power struggle with China. And that geopolitical conflict is going to continue to flare up in the years ahead. And we're going to need to grapple with that. We're going to need to really grapple with the domestic implications because every time we ramp up the rhetoric around China, it is going to lead to more anti-API hate and violence. And that's something I think we need to just forecast and understand is an ever-present threat to our community. And then finally, there are a significant number of API adults who don't trust either party to handle major policy priorities. So what's going to be really key here is cultural competency and understanding and really dedicated outreach engagement to making sure that APIs have that trust. So guns as a wedge issue, I appreciate what Josh sort of illuminated as part of his presentation and the risks in terms of how the gun lobby and firearms industry is trying to mobilize and win hearts and minds in our API communities. I think Josh already sort of covered this piece, but I do want to note that I think promoting gun sales and gun ownership is, I think, one piece of, I think, the political risks here. I think for me, as someone who's sort of in the API movement, I think my greater fear, not my greater fear, but a sort of complementary fear is that that is an entree point to trying to engage API gun owners in a much more explicitly conservative political and policy agenda. So it's not just about these organizations and the gun lobby and the firearms industry exploiting our fears and concerns to promote the Second Amendment. It's about all the other things. And that's really, really, I think, worrying for me as someone who works at a progressive API organization. The other thing I wanted to know is that that the gun lobby and firearms industry really threatens to derail the focus from what we really truly need to do if we're going to achieve long-term community-based solutions. For ones that we know and we've discussed, and my fellow presenters have talked about, gun sales, gun ownership, that's only going to increase risk of death and violence. And it would be such a tragedy that the whole movement around stopping API hate leads to the exploitation of fears and concerns that will result in more gun sales, that will result in more death and violence in our communities. So, I'll just say that other alternatives to safety include more resources to community-based organizations that are at the front lines to helping provide the services that are needed by our community members, more public education outreach campaigns in multiple languages to inform us of our rights, and also institutions of their obligations, and then more curriculum that teaches our history to promote racial awareness and understanding. And I'll just sort of raise up the example of Illinois, where they just recently passed legislation on teaching AAPI history to help promote racial understanding and awareness, and ultimately empathy among young people, which we think is really key to helping address the issue of anti-API violence in the long haul. And then finally, just with respect to how guns are going to pose a risk in terms of capturing the hearts and minds of API voters to support a broader political and policy agenda that's very conservative and frankly not ultimately beneficial to our communities. And then finally, and I think this is a really important point, I think conservative forces are also trying to drive a wedge between API voters and Black and Brown communities and to sensationalize the violence in unhelpful ways. And I want to just say that, as part of my organization, we're really committed to building racial solidarity, to addressing the root causes of violence against us, which is white supremacy and systemic racism. I should just also note that anti-API racism is not just interpersonal, right? It's not just between individuals, but it's also institutional. So any solution to addressing the violence that we're facing has to include addressing systemic racism and white supremacy. And I should again just note that most anti-API hate incidences that we're facing are not criminal in nature. So doubling down on policing will not be effective, but also doubling down or trying to promote gun sales is not the solution to what we're facing. So I'll just leave it at that and kick it back to Poe or Gloria.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much for really like pulling it together so that we can see, you know, what the things that we really need to be worried about right now and where we need to really like focus attention. We intended to leave time at the very end, but we only have 3 minutes left because actually there's just like so much to say. On one hand, gun violence is an ongoing and terrible problem for our country, and it's extremely complicated. And then the other hand is that, you know, the Asian American community is complicated, and it's increasingly important in terms of the makeup of our country, where we're heading as a democracy. So there's just like a lot to say, and they didn't leave a lot of time to have the open discussion that we intended. I will just like read a few comments that I see in the chat box from Shireen. She says that it's interesting, Andy, that you said that more policing isn't going to solve this. And I just see a lot of comments thanking us for talking about this. This is an intersection between the intersection of gun violence prevention and AAPI is an emerging one. And I think it has really a lot of implications. So we only have 2 more minutes. Does anybody have, first of all, I want to thank all of you for bringing your expertise and your passion and to this panel. And I just feel so fortunate to be able to be working with you on an ongoing basis. You know, we're trying to start this new coalition to really like focus on this intersection on an ongoing basis. And I am very honored to be, you know, in the trenches with you all. Does anybody have any like last thoughts that they would like to share in the last moment that we had together?
Gloria, I just want to thank you for pulling this amazing panel together to provide information, data, and our thoughts on this issue. And I look forward to working with you and the rest of the team to convince Asian Americans that guns don't make us safer.
Thank you. So I also want to underline the new research that came out. We don't have enough research as it is, and now to have research actually about Asian Americans and guns is really extraordinary. And I look forward to seeing the final research and more from both of you, Xin-Fang and Suyin, and also Josh. Thank you so much for your support. And looking forward to hearing from you and your deep knowledge about the gun violence prevention world. And Andy, as usual, civil rights leader and hero. So thank you all for joining us. If you have any thoughts or questions that you would like to share with us after this panel, you can, I mean, I think all of us are actually pretty easily findable online. You can email all of us, or you can just email any questions and thoughts to keepmarching@momsrising.org. That's keepmarching@momsrising.org. You can collect thoughts and questions there that I will make sure to share with the rest of the panelists. Thank you all.